Good morning. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, good morning and welcome. Today marks the beginning of Westminster's signature event, the Hancock Symposium. The symposium began in 2006 under then Senior Vice President and Dean of Faculty, and then later President Barney Forsyth. Dr. Forsyth's vision was to bring the world to Westminster to discuss critical issues that face us as the world shrinks, technology brings us closer together, and we look for solutions to those intractable problems that face our world. Thank you for attending this year's symposium, and I want to give special thanks to David Hancock, class of 1967, and his wife Linda for making this symposium a reality. Their generous gift, the Hancock Symposium, has now affected 3 generations of Westminster students. It has garnered national and even international attention. And this year's symposium, Advocacy and Activism, Leading from Where You Are, will leave an indelible mark on the history of this great series of symposia and the college itself. So dig in, learn something new, and continue to keep an open mind as you enjoy this gift that we give to you. The gift of a true liberal arts education that is what the 2017 Hancock Symposium is all about. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mark Bolton. Dr. Bolton is Associate Professor of History, and he is a Fellow of the prestigious Royal Historical Society of London. He earned a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Wales with honors, a master's degree in history from the University of Southern Mississippi, and a PhD in history from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Dr. Bolton's first book, Failing Our Veterans, The GI Bill and the Vietnam Generation, has received national and international acclaim. His expertise on the history of the Vietnam War has led him to take students to Vietnam to study the war and the country's history. He has worked closely with the Westminster student veterans, and he is an outstanding classroom teacher as well. So please join me in giving a huge round of applause to this year's Hancock Symposium Committee Chair, Dr. Mark Bolton. Thank you.
Good morning all. Thank you all for being here today. I had 2 choices. The first one was I was going to stand up here and read my son's favorite book, A is for Activism. But in the interests of time constraint, I think I'm going to have to stick to my pre-prepared comments. To be chair of this symposium committee is truly a privilege and an honor. Because of the generosity of the Hancock family, not only do you get a chance to give something back to the students and the community, but you also get to work with some of Westminster's most dedicated students, faculty, and staff. And could you please now join me in thanking the members of the committee who are responsible for putting this program together. And if the committee members could please join to be recognized, Professors Kurt Jefferson, Ryan Brunner, Mary Majuris, Callie Wright-Smith, the Reverend Jamie Haskins, and our fantastic students, Sawyer Young, Celeste Cummings, and Sydney Franklin, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. Could you all stand, please, and be recognized by the crowd? Thank you. Thank you. And in full disclosure, one of them should probably be up here today instead of me. For they, like many of you in the audience, have led a far more dedicated life of activism than I can claim. But I'm a bit selfish, because when the subject of activism and advocacy was first proposed as a symposium topic, I wanted to be a part of it. Because I spend a lot of time discussing social movements in my history classes, and I know the power and influence they have in making the world a better place. Activists, those who step forward to push for social and political change, and advocates, those who amplify their voices, have demonstrated extraordinary leadership and courage, often facing great hardship, sometimes paying the ultimate price, to make sure that this is a more rational, tolerant, and humane world. Their efforts have gone a long way to ensuring that the arc of the moral universe has indeed bent toward justice. You know their names and places. In the United States, individuals stepped up to ensure that the incredible promise of this nation and its founding documents would be fulfilled. that life, liberty, and happiness would extend from the few to the many. Be it Dr. King on the battlefields of Birmingham, Alabama, or Vine Deloria Jr. pushing for Native American rights, or Rachel Carson alerting us to the consequences of environmental degradation, or Cesar Chavez, Harvey Milk, Betty Friedan, the list could go on. Their actions ensured that America would remain, as John Winthrop hoped, and as Ronald Reagan liked to remind us, a city upon a hill, with the eyes of the world upon it. Internationally, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Lech Wałęsa fought against the odious tenets of imperialism, apartheid, and communist totalitarianism. It was never easy. For every school kid on the streets of Birmingham, there was a police chief, Bull Connor, standing with attack dogs and water cannons to cut them down. For every freedom fighter in Budapest or Tiananmen Square, there was a tank ready to crush their message of hope. But enormous progress was made through their sacrifice, because they promoted a sense of collective responsibility to our neighbor, our nation, and the wider global community. It was their actions that sustained an unprecedented era of global progress. For in the aftermath of World War II, we moved away from toxic nationalism toward greater international cooperation. We created global organizations to promote human rights and to check our more violent impulses. We opened our borders to people and to trade, and we showed compassion to refugees and the disadvantaged. Now it feels like we're entering an existential time in human history. Countries are turning their back on global cooperation. We're seeing the rise of nativist movements across the globe. We're seeing the breakdown of common decency in politics on a local and national level. We're losing our faith in the institutions and ideas that make us strong: a free and independent press, higher education, science, and evidence-based empirical learning. And we have politicians that are seeking to put up literal and figurative walls to divide us. So I am selfish in being here, because I have a healthy dose of anxiety about what comes next, and I want help figuring it out. But I also have a tremendous amount of hope, and it is because of the people to whom we will be listening at this symposium. They are the ideological heirs of the great advocates and activists, and they are living proof that we have the power to decide where we go next. They are individuals that can inspire us and can start the conversation of how we move forward, and to make sure that the progress we have made is not lost. And what a lineup we have. We began with Cassie Dillon's inspirational talk yesterday, and in a few minutes up on stage, we will listen to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, recognized as Time Magazine's one of their most influential 100 people in the world, among her many accolades. Tomorrow, we will hear from Senator Bernie Sanders, whom Time readers declared to be the most influential person in the world in 2016. And a man who has repeatedly been declared the most popular active politician in America today. In between, to name a few, we have biker gangs speaking out against child abuse. We have aspiring politicians. We have inspiring authors, including our own Westminster legend, Dave Collins. We have dynamic CEOs, such as Forrester Furrow. We have business and industry leaders and leaders of faith. And some of these are Westminster's finest alums. We have a veteran who flew over 100 combat missions in Vietnam. And we have one of the nation's leading terrorism experts as well. And then tomorrow morning, we'll begin back here listening to the uplifting message and music of rap activist Aisha Fukushima. There are many others on this program, and I encourage you all to find your own path to enlightenment. In selecting these individuals, the committee looked for a few common traits. One was leadership. People who saw a problem in society and stepped up to solve it. The other was a sense of entrepreneurship. They created organizations and systems of outreach to ensure that their message was translated into action. We did not bring in spokespeople from major organizations. We went after people who did it for themselves. But above all, what unites them is their sense of compassion, either for the group they represent or for the people to whom they give voice. Walls can be erected. Yet, as tens of thousands of people in Eastern Europe proved, and as Sir Winston Churchill's granddaughter, Edwina Sands, has given us a powerful reminder of outside of these doors, they can be broken down. Voices of hatred are allowed to cry out on our streets, as is their right, but we have the power to drown them out with louder voices of compassion. And Westminster is the place to start these conversations. We have the history, but above all, we have the students, who have a legacy of being open-minded, charitable, empathetic, and capable of changing the world. So I invite you over the next 2 days to listen to the words and ideas of our speakers. You do not have to agree with them. You can be challenged. You can be angry. But be inspired by what they have achieved. And then, by all means, add your voice to their chorus, or find an alternative, authentic voice of your own. I often like to end my history courses by referring back to Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address of March 1861, when, with the Union crumbling around him, he looked forward to a more positive time, one which would be achieved only when the nation, he remarked, had rekindled its bonds of affection and when its people appealed to the better angels of their nature. I hope that in the coming days you will witness some of that affection and maybe find a few of those better angels. And let us make sure that the light shining out of this great college, as it has in the past and will continue to do, remains a beacon of hope. When world leaders visited our campus in the past, they helped define the last century. Now let us set about the task of defining the next. Thank you. And now it is my very great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, the Reverend Cliff Kane, the Harrod C.S. Lewis Professor of Religious Studies at Westminster, who will introduce our first speaker. Cliff?
It is such a great pleasure and a great privilege to welcome Katharine Hayhoe to our campus and to briefly introduce her to you. Of course, Katharine Hayhoe needs no introduction for persons who live at the intersection of religion and the environment. She's a major player, an indomitable force for good, an atmospheric scientist, and a Christian. Her faith and her profession have placed her in the important but perhaps unenviable position of presenting the facts about climate change and then lobbying for religious people and non-religious people, skeptics and doubters, and the convinced and the activists to work together across the lines that divide us to save what scientists call nature and what those of us of religious faith call creation. Nature, the creation, our precious jewel of life and beauty, is in jeopardy. And we have no one to blame but ourselves. But what is the way out of this morass, this dilemma, this predicament? How can we save the planet and in the process save ourselves? Certainly in an existential sense, and perhaps also in a spiritual sense as well. For we are committing suicide as we plunder and imperil, as we degrade and destroy that which has been entrusted to our care. I think that there is no one better than Katharine Hayhoe to speak to this situation. Dr. Hayhoe is a distinguished and internationally known atmospheric scientist who currently serves as Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University. Trained as a physicist in undergraduate school at the University of Toronto, she holds a Master of Science degree and a PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois. Her work has resulted in over 120 peer-reviewed publications in the top journals in the field of climate change. Last year, she teamed up with her local PBS station in Texas, KTTZ, to write and produce a series on the web called Global Weirding. Given the quantity and quality of her work, and her willingness and passion to speak from the heart and then from the head and then move back to the heart again for a commitment to solutions, it's not surprising that she has been named, as Professor Bolton pointed out, one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people and one of Foreign Policy magazine's 100 leading global thinkers, and one of Politico's 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics, and one of Fortune's 50 world's greatest leaders. The recipient of a Nobel Prize, Dr. Hayhoe, has also received the Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education, the Climate Communication Prize from the American Geophysical Union, and the Distinguished Service Award from the Sierra Club. Dr. Hayhoe will explore this morning the intersections of scientific fact and the ideological, socioeconomic, and religious lines that keep Americans constantly divided on climate change. Very importantly, she will also offer suggestions for shifting the focus toward climate action based on Americans' shared values and concerns. Please join me in welcoming to Westminster College, to the symposium, and to this lectern, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Katharine?
Thank you, Cliff, for that kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today. I am a scientist, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is the biggest lesson that I have learned over the past years of being a scientist, and that is the lesson that when it comes to deeply politically polarized issues, such as just about every session in the symposium addresses, facts are not enough. One of the most frequent questions I get on a weekly, sometimes even a daily basis is, could you just explain the facts to my family member, neighbor, colleague, friend, politician? If you just explained it to them so clearly as you do, I know they would change their minds. And unfortunately, the social science has showed us that it doesn't work. When we are arguing over issues that are not just a matter of what's up here, but more a matter of what's down here, our identity, who we feel we are, arguing over issues like that dig a deeper trench between us. So, how can we talk about these issues? We can talk about them by engaging from the heart. Now, are there facts? There definitely are. We'll talk about some of those facts. But the bottom line is we have bought into the idea that we have to be a certain type of person to care about climate change. If we vote left, if we hug trees, if we bike to school, then, we're probably the type of person who does. But if we vote right, if we like our cars and our warm showers and our large steaks, then we don't. And people say, well, yes, but surely we just need more information. In fact, I was just at a big science conference this summer with speakers like Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson and every astronaut who's walked on the moon. And almost every speaker deplored the state of scientific understanding in the public today, and almost every speaker suggested further science education as the solution. But when we look at issues like climate change, which again is one of the most politically polarized issues in the country right now, we see that how much we know about science does not predict our opinion on whether we agree that climate is changing and humans are responsible. You know what's the number one predictor of our opinion on climate change that outweighs everything else? Where we fall on the political spectrum. The further to one side versus the other we are, the more likely we are or not to agree with the science. And that factor, political ideology, is moderated by two other factors that are also very relevant to our discussion today and tomorrow. Where we lie on the political spectrum is often moderated by our age and by our race. You can see this is about identity. It is about who we are and who we perceive ourselves to be. And that's why, when it comes to climate change, the facts are not enough anymore. So I'm going to talk to you today about 3 big myths that many of us believe. The first myth has to do with the science of climate change. The second myth has to do with the impacts of climate change. And the third myth has to do with the solutions to climate change. And in a way, the arc of this conversation patterns my own career, because I began in science. And when I gave my first presentation to a local women's group that had asked me to come talk about climate change, I started with the science, I continued with the science, and I ended with the science. And everybody was left asking me, so what? So what? So that was how I realized, oh, we have to go further than the science. We have to talk about the impacts. Why do we even care about this thing anyways? So then I started talking about not just the science, but the impacts too. And my research actually eventually started turning in that direction to look at how climate change matters to us in the places where we live. And then what kind of questions did I get? Then the questions I got were, okay, so you've told us the science and you told us why it matters, but what can I do about it? And that for me was the steepest learning curve, because as a scientist, we're like a doctor who diagnoses the condition, but we're not the pharmacist, we're not the doctor who can prescribe the treatments. So I had to educate myself on what are the solutions, what are we doing about this problem, what can we do about it? So what's the first myth that has to do with the science? The first myth is that it isn't science. The first myth is that it is a earth-worshipping religion, not science. You choose to believe in it at the exclusion, as this real church sign says, at the exclusion of believing in God. If you want further evidence that it is a religion rather than a science, all you have to do is Google it, and you will see the Church of Climatology. It worships a polar bear sitting on a piece of melting ice, Al Gore, minister. What's the second myth that we've bought into when it comes to impacts? Well, if you had to design the cover of a book on climate change or global warming, what is the #1 image that the most people would pick to put on a cover of a book about global warming? I'll give you a clue. You just saw a picture of it. It is white, it is furry, and it is usually, again, sitting on a piece of ice looking sad. The second myth we have bought into is that it really only matters for the polar bears or future generations. And honestly, I think this myth is more pernicious and widespread than the myth that climate change is some type of religion. Because when you survey the country and you ask people, do you think climate change will affect future generations? Just about everybody actually says yes. More people say yes to that than say yes to climate change is real and humans are causing it. So more people think it's going to affect people than it's actually real. You see how this gets a bit confusing. And then you say to people, will it affect plants and animals? Everybody says yes. Will it affect people in poor countries? Everybody says yes. And then you say, will it affect you in the places where you live? Almost everybody across the entire United States, the majority of people say no. That is a huge myth. And then what's the third myth? The third myth has to do with solutions, and it is the myth that we often hear from politicians that we have to choose between the environment and the economy. And fixing climate change will bankrupt us. So the most responsible thing is to continue to grow the economy, and if the impacts ever get bad enough, as if they haven't already, if they ever get bad enough, then we'll have all the money in the world to fix them. Those are the myths. So let's unpack each one of those myths. Myth #1, you have to believe in it. This is a very widespread myth. Senator Lindsey Graham, who is well known for acknowledging that climate is changing and humans are responsible and we should even do something about it, give him full credit for that, he even says the problem is that Al Gore has turned this thing into a religion. And as we saw, there is ample evidence on the internet, and if anybody has sharp eyes, you will notice that somebody actually photoshopped my head onto the choir. You find some very interesting things on the internet. One of the most frequent other questions I get, besides, could you just explain the facts to so-and-so, one of the most frequent other questions I get is, do you believe in global warming? And I usually get that question from somebody who is ready to jump on me and say, aha, you believe in that false earth-worshipping religion. You say you're a Christian, but you can't possibly be a real one. When I wrote my book with my husband, we wrote a book together called A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. My husband is the pastor of an evangelical church in Texas and a popular Christian author. When he and I wrote our book together, I was nervous about what my colleagues would think of the fact that I was telling people that, yes, I'm a Christian, not just a Christian, I'm one of those evangelical Christians you hear about, that most of them in the US don't think climate change is real. I grew up in Canada, and so I actually didn't realize that was a thing until I moved to the States. I so didn't realize it was a thing that my husband and I had been married for 6 months before we realized we were on the opposite sides of the fence on this one. We're on the same side now, obviously, since we wrote the book together. So when I wrote this book, I was concerned of what my colleagues would think. And it turned out that my concern was largely unfounded. My colleagues have been incredibly supportive, even going out of their way to either say, I share your faith, how can I help? Or to say, I don't share your faith, but I think what you're doing is fantastic. No. Where the attacks came from were from other Christians. I get hate mail and evil comments on social media, via email, even handwritten letters, every day. And I often look at these people because I want to know, who are they and why do they think it's okay to send somebody they don't know such an evil, hateful message? And when I look at them, what absolutely breaks my heart is well over half of the people, well over half, some days 80 to 90%, well over half of the people self-identify themselves as Christians, with Bible verses in their social media profiles, or Jesus lover, or they use biblical language to condemn me as the whore of Babylon or Jezebel for studying God's creation. So I'm often asked, do you believe in global warming? And my answer to people, I think, surprises them. My answer is no. And then that kind of rocks people back in their tracks because they say, well, aren't you a climate scientist? Isn't this what you do? I say, well, as this man said, science does not demand belief. Scientists don't collect themselves every Sunday and join hands singing, yes, gravity is real, I will have faith. Whether you believe in gravity or not, and I don't know whether this horse believed in gravity or not, if you step off the cliff, you are going down. Climate change is real regardless of what I believe. I do not believe in it. I have looked at the evidence. And the evidence comes from scientific instruments like thermometers. And as my husband says, a thermometer is not Democrat or Republican. It does not give you a different answer depending on how you vote. So what are the facts that make me not believe in global warming? What are the facts that make me say the balance of the evidence says, yeah, this thing is real and this thing really is, for the first time in the history of this planet, it is us. Here are the facts. Now, first of all, I just want to give you one definition. You may be thinking, I didn't sign up for science class at 9:30 in the morning. Don't worry. There are no equations and there will be no math, just one definition. And that is the fact that we're not talking about weather here. Weather is what happens in a certain place at a certain time. It's like a single tree. We are talking about climate, which is like a forest. It's the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. Think of it like a class. One student may do fantastic on the midterm. Another student might fail. And so one student's experience is completely different than the other, but if the average is a solid B+ or A-, then the class as a whole is doing okay. That's the difference between climate and weather. Why is this important? Because between the months of November and March, the number one question that we hear, and we even hear this in the media often, is, it's freezing, where's global warming now? And it's often accompanied by a look like this. People say, it snowed, the planet can't be warming. Or they say, it's cold outside, we just set a new record. But saying that it's cold where I am on this day, so therefore the entire planet can't be warming over climate timescales, which is, again, the average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years, is like saying I'm on the Titanic. You remember the Titanic? I'm on the Titanic, and the ship can't be sinking because my end just went 200 feet up in the air. We have to look at the whole record. And so, for example, when we look at the temperature, average temperature for Missouri, this is average temperature for the state of Missouri, we can see that some years are colder and other years are warmer. That's weather. And so one year, if you were on the deck of the Titanic saying it's not sinking, one year you might be saying, well, it's very cold this year, can't be warming. And then the next year you'd say, oh my goodness, it's the hottest year we've ever seen. No, you have to look at the long-term trend over at least 20 to 30 years, and when we look at the long-term trend, it's very obvious that it is getting warmer, and in fact, what's also obvious if you have sharp eyes is that the variability is increasing, right? So it's going up and down even more, and that often has a greater impact on us, especially people who are farmers or water managers. That's Missouri. What about the US? Well, if we look at the whole continental US, yep, it's also warming. You see the variability is a little bit less because we're looking over a larger area. And then lastly, if we look at the entire planet, this is global temperature measured by tens of thousands of thermometers around the whole planet, it's warming too. 2016 was the warmest year on record. Will 2017 be the next warmest? Probably not, because it goes up and down from year to year, that's weather. But over climate timescales, the average of 20 to 30 years, our temperatures are steadily going up. Now, some people say, yeah, but those thermometers, you cannot trust those thermometers. Those scientists are manipulating the data. Now, they have done analysis where they just looked at rural thermometers versus urban. They looked at long-term versus short-term. They used satellite observations and ocean buoys, and they all show the same thing. But I am okay with throwing out all the thermometers, throw out all the satellites, throw out all the human measurements. Because when we simply look at what is happening in the world around us, there is ample evidence of a warming planet that anybody can see in the places where they live. Let me give you 4 examples. Up in the Arctic, what used to be permanently frozen ground, so permanently frozen that entire towns were built on it, that ground is now thawing and crumbling and eroding into the ocean because it's getting warmer. In fact, the Arctic is warming twice as fast as down here. In Japan, they've been keeping records of when the cherry trees have blossomed in Kyoto, Japan for 1,100 years. And today, those cherry trees are blossoming on average 3 weeks earlier in the year than any time in the 1,100-year record. Across the United States, the growing season has lengthened by anywhere from 1.5 to 3 weeks, depending on where we live. In Washington, D.C., they have these cherry trees too, and they're also blooming earlier in the year. We know that the plants in our garden where we live are blooming earlier. The seasons are getting weirder. We're also seeing increases in heavy rainfall events. Why? Because warmer air holds more water. And so the warmer it gets, the more water evaporates into the air, and along comes a storm, it sweeps that water up and it dumps it on us. And that's one of the most definitive signs of a warming planet, is increases in heavy rain events. And then the biggie, right? We aren't seeing any more frequent hurricanes, even though this year is a really bad year. It happens. 2005 was also a really bad year. We aren't seeing more frequent hurricanes, but we are seeing more rainfall associated with those hurricanes. We're seeing higher sea levels driving stronger storm surges associated with hurricanes. And there's some indication as well that the intensity and the speed at which hurricanes ratchet up from a Category 1 to a Category 5 is increasing because they get their energy from warm ocean water. We're also seeing animals and insects and plants and birds moving poleward. If we look around God's creation for evidence of a warming planet, do you know how many independent lines of evidence there are? Pick a number in your head. How many independent lines of evidence of a warming planet do you think there are? The last time that scientists counted, and this number is actually 10 years old, so it's probably higher now, the last time they counted, we were at 26,500. We don't need thermometers to tell us it's warming. Often we only have to look in our own backyards. So this thing is real. But how do we know that it's us? Because if you've ever watched the Ice Age movies, quick poll, Ice Age movies, a whole lot of people there in the front rows don't want to admit it, but we all know that you did. Ice Age movies, we know that climate has changed in the past, right? It used to be colder, sometimes it was warmer, dinosaurs, ice sheets. We know that climate has changed in the past, so we have to say, when it's getting warmer, we have to say, couldn't this just be natural, right? Because it could. We've seen it change in the past. The reason why climate has changed in the past is often because the amount of energy we get from the sun has changed, or because of natural cycles. So let's just take a quick look at both of those reasons. Here's the temperature of our entire Earth. This time we're going all the way back to 1900. You can see it goes up and down from year to year, but long term, over climate timescales, it increases. Now, if we were warming because of the sun, does that mean we would be getting more energy from the sun or less energy from the sun? We should be getting more, right? Imagine you have a lamp on a dimmer switch. You turn up the lamp, it gives off more heat, right? So let's look at energy from the sun. Well, energy from the sun was going up a little bit. It wasn't actually that much, but it was going up a little bit to the 70s. But since the 70s, it's been going down. So if our temperature were controlled by the sun right now, the sun has its regular 11-year cycle, which you can see in the sunspots discovered by Galileo. But it also goes up and down randomly over time, and if we were being controlled by the sun right now, we'd be getting cooler, not warmer. Well, then you might say, yes, but what about those ice age cycles? Because aren't we just getting warmer after the last ice age? The last ice age ended 18,000 years ago, roughly. And if we look at the history of human civilization, our civilization has been around for about 6,000 years. If we look at the history of civilization, this is what temperature looks like around the world. Now you might say, hang on, you didn't have thermometers back then. It's true. The first thermometer was invented in 1658, and that was when the first record of temperature began too. The Central England temperature record goes back to 1658. But we have natural thermometers in tree rings and ice cores and even written historical records like the cherry tree records in Kyoto, Japan. And when we put together all of those natural thermometers around the world, we get a picture of what the world looked like. And in fact, what happened was warming after the last ice age peaked between 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And since then, we were on a very, very gradual slide into the next ice age. You can calculate where we are in the ice age cycles, and according to the ice age cycles, we should have been back in another ice age sometime within the next 1,500 years. Now, don't get me wrong, that would be a very bad thing. Anybody who's familiar with the ice age knows that most of Canada and a good part of the Midwest was covered in about a mile of ice at that time. We don't want another ice age. What is the best temperature for humans? The nice temperature that we have had over the last few thousand years, that is the perfect temperature for us. It enabled us to grow from a few million to over 7 billion people because we had just the right conditions. But as you can see, we have no fear of heading into the next ice age now. We have not just stabilized our climate, which is the best thing for us, we have turned it around and we are heading abruptly in the other direction. And temperature is not the only thing heading abruptly in the other direction. There's also this little thing called carbon dioxide, which we will get to in a second, that is also heading abruptly in the other direction. So if it isn't the sun, if it isn't a natural cycle, we finally now have permission, so to speak, to say, okay, well, what could it be then? If it isn't a natural factor, if according to natural factors right now we should be cooling and we are not, what could be causing us to warm? And when we ask that question, we don't have to look far. Because the increase in temperature and the increase in carbon dioxide coincides with a very important time in our life history, the Industrial Revolution. That was when we figured out how to dig massive amounts of coal, of natural gas, and of oil out of the ground and burn it. Those fuels contain carbon. And when you burn it, it combines with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide. That was the green line I just showed you. We know how much carbon we've produced because we keep written records of how much coal and gas and oil we dig up and sell. And we know that that has been increasing enormously. Why do we care about carbon dioxide? We care about it because it is a powerful heat-trapping gas. It's a powerful heat-trapping gas that already occurs naturally in the real world. And so then people might say, well, if it's natural, what's the problem? Well, food is natural, but what happens if we eat way too much food, and especially the type of food that's not healthy for us in large amounts? Water is natural, but you can die from drowning. Vitamins are good for us, so is medicine. But you take too many of them, and you can get sick and even die. Everything in moderation is actually one of the tenets of our faith. Yet we have not been moderate in the amount of carbon dioxide that we're pumping into the atmosphere. We are disrupting the natural carbon cycle, during which this amount of carbon from deep in the ground wouldn't get to the atmosphere in the natural order of things for millions of years if the planet still exists at that point. We have been making it happen in a matter of years to decades. Why does this matter? It matters because, see if I can push the right button here, it's a little tricky. There we go, that's working. It matters because our planet, that's our happy planet, our planet already has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and other heat-trapping gases keep us warm. The sun's energy shines down and heats up the earth, and the earth gives off heat energy. And just like a blanket keeps you warm on a cold night, the blanket of heat-trapping gases keeps our planet almost 60 degrees Fahrenheit, or over 30 degrees Celsius, warmer than we would be otherwise. We would be a frozen ball of ice without this blanket. So if this is totally natural and essential to life, what's the problem? The problem is we're digging up and burning massive amounts of carbon dioxide that's wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that we never needed. Just like when I used to go stay at my grandma's when I was little, and every night she would sneak in and put an extra blanket on me. And every night I would wake up sweating, saying, "Grandma, I didn't need the blanket." In the same way, we're wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it does not need, and that is why it is running a fever. How long have we known about this extra blanket? Well, we've known about the natural blanket since the work of Joseph Fourier in 1820. Yeah, that's right, you heard me right. 200 years we've known about the natural blanket. How long have we known that fossil fuel use, coal and gas and oil, was wrapping an extra blanket around the planet? We've known since Joseph Tyndale's experiments in the 1850s. Yes, 170 years almost we've known about this extra blanket. How long have we known how much the world would warm if we doubled or tripled this extra blanket? Arrhenius, third person in the row there, Arrhenius was a Swedish chemist who in his spare time, after winning the Nobel Prize, decided he was going to calculate how much the world would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. He calculated these numbers in 1890, and he was pretty right. And then Guy Callender, the last person here, was a British engineer who, in between working for the railway and doing top secret military research for the government, in between that, he decided he was going to write to all these scientists around the world and collect temperature data from all the different thermometers around the world and see if he could determine whether the world was warming in response to this extra blanket. And he found that it was. He published his work in 1938. We've known for 80 years that the data actually shows that it's warming. So it isn't just real, it's us, no belief required. If you want more on this, I have this little series called Global Weirding. It's a PBS digital series. It's online, the videos are short, about 5 to 8 minutes each. Just Google Global Weirding and you will find it. And our most recent one that just came out this past week is called It's Just a Natural Cycle, Isn't It? So if you want more, you can find it there. But this myth, this myth that climate change is a religion is not true. I don't believe in it. I look to facts and data, and what I do believe in, the Bible, doesn't talk about climate change. I have another Global Weirding video called The Bible Doesn't Talk About Climate Change, Does It? And it doesn't. There's no climate change words in the Bible. But there's a lot of words about our attitudes and actions, and what we see happening to this planet is entirely consistent with what Paul wrote to the Corinthians, saying, they said, well, do I have the right to do everything? You know, if I'm completely forgiven by God for everything I do I have the right to do everything? And Paul says, well, you have the right to do everything, but not everything is beneficial. Not everything is beneficial. Use the brain God gave you to decide what's beneficial because, as it says in Galatians, we reap what we sow. And what we're seeing today is simply the consequences of deciding to get all of our energy from coal and gas and oil without thinking about everything that we were putting into the atmosphere at that time. It's a consequence of a decision we made. Nothing more, nothing less. Myth number 2. It only matters to the polar bears. Now, it absolutely does matter to the polar bears. The polar bears live on the ice. I've been up there and seen how the ice is coming weeks later in the year, and it's breaking up weeks earlier in the year, and the polar bears only feed on the ice. And so when they're on land, they're basically starving, waiting for the ice to come back. The polar bears are at serious risk. But when I went up to the Arctic with Polar Bears International, I went there with them because of one thing they said to me. They said, we care about the polar bears because after them, we're next. And that's what I study. I study what climate change means to us in the places where we live. We have built the vulnerability to climate change into our very human systems. What do I mean by that? We have 7.5 billion people almost on the planet today. Did you know that 2/3 of the world's largest cities in every continent of the world almost, Southeast Asia, Europe, Africa, North and South America, 2/3 of the world's biggest cities are located within a few feet of sea level, and sea level is rising. We cannot pick up a city of 5 or 10 million people and just move it, no matter how rich we get. Almost every acre of arable land is parceled out and allocated. If we can no longer grow the crops we need there to support our family, where will we go? It isn't like we can just pick up our tents and move to a new place and take over somebody else's land. And just about every drop of water is already over-allocated. So when rainfall patterns change and droughts get stronger and longer, there isn't enough water already to go around. The reason we care about climate change isn't just because of the polar bear, it's because it exacerbates so many of the risks that we already face today. What type of risks do we already face today? So many of them. Here's just a couple of the risks that are being exacerbated by a changing climate. Heavy rainfall is becoming more frequent and more intense in a warmer world. Remember, because water evaporates, it's sitting up there, the storm comes along, picks it up, dumps it on us. And this is especially happening in the Northeast and the Midwest. Since the 1950s, we have seen big increases in heavy rain events. If you think that that's been happening, you're right. It really has been happening in the places where you live. We're also seeing that heat waves are becoming stronger and more intense. And they have enormous impacts on our health, on our agriculture, on our energy use and our water supply. Now, we're still breaking cold records. That's still happening. But if climate weren't changing, we would be breaking the same amount of cold records as hot records. Instead, as of the last decade, we were breaking hot temperature records twice as frequently as cold ones. And this decade is going to be even more. If you live in the West, you might say, are forest fires getting worse? They are too. We don't see any more of them, but the ones that we get are burning much greater areas because they have hotter and drier conditions. And if you look at the area burned, you can even see this with your eyes. When you look at the financial risks associated with billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, they are going up for two reasons. Reason number one is there's more of us and we're building more expensive stuff in harm's way, and that is a huge factor. But number two is climate change is exacerbating them. So I can't move on without talking about the one thing that we are just glued to the news on these days. This is a picture from 2 weeks ago. These are 3 hurricanes, Katia, Jose, and Irma, in the Gulf of Mexico at the same time. This is not photoshopped. This is a real picture. In this season, we say, what is happening to our world? Here's what we know. As the world warms, we're seeing more rainfall on average associated with a given hurricane. Now, some have more, Harvey, some have less, Irma. But on average, there's more rainfall associated with a given hurricane because of the more water vapor sitting up there, ready for that giant hurricane to sweep up and dump on us. We're also seeing higher sea levels because the sea level is rising. Warmer water takes up more space, and land-based ice is melting and going into the ocean. And so that means when a storm surge comes from the hurricane, there's more water behind it. It will flood a greater area. We don't expect, I know this sounds weird, but we don't expect any more hurricanes in the future. We just expect some really bad years like this year and some not so bad years like last year. But what we do expect is, on average, our hurricanes are going to be getting stronger because they get their energy from warm ocean water. And you know that extra blanket we're wrapping around our planet? Over 90% of the extra heat being trapped by that blanket we're wrapping around our planet is going into the ocean. And in the ocean, what does it do? It feeds hurricanes and it helps them intensify faster. That's the deal with hurricanes. We care about a changing climate because it exacerbates the risks we already face today. And this is true whether we live in North America or whether we live in Bangladesh, where a few weeks ago, almost half of the entire country of Bangladesh was underwater. Why didn't we hear more about this? Because we were preoccupied with Harvey at the same time. We care about drought whether it happens in Texas or whether it happens in Syria, where a record-breaking drought during the 2000s drove hundreds of thousands of farmers into the cities, doubling the unemployment rate, contributing to the refugee crisis. We care about what's happening on our coasts, whether we live in Long Island or whether we live in the Arctic. And we care about heat waves and their impact on our health and our infrastructure, whether we live in Australia or whether we live in India. We care about a changing climate because it increases our risks, but here is the bottom line. The more vulnerable we already are, the more we're affected. What countries are most affected by a changing climate? The countries that hardly contributed at all to the problem. We care about a changing climate not just because of its impact on me, on us, on my family, on my community, on the place where I live. We care about it because it disproportionately affects the poor and the vulnerable, and that is not fair. We care about climate change because it exacerbates issues like hunger, poverty, access to clean water, and disease. I care about climate change. As someone who grew up in a developing country, when I was 9 years old, we moved down to Colombia in South America. And when you live in a place where you realize, and many of you do, and many of you have, you realize we are incredibly vulnerable. We're not insulated by our air conditioners, by our 24-hour emergency clinics. We're incredibly vulnerable. And the reason why we care about a changing climate is because we could be pouring all of our efforts, all of our time, all of our money, all of our hope and prayers into a bucket to try to fix hunger, poverty, injustice. But climate change is a hole in the bucket, and that hole is getting bigger and bigger. I care about climate change, personally myself, I care about climate change because it is exacerbating almost every single humanitarian issue on this planet today. We cannot fix poverty, disease, lack of access to clean water, even political strife and violence, which has been shown to correlate with climate and weather risks. We cannot fix these things if we leave climate change out of the picture anymore. And to look to that motivation, again, I look to my faith. In 1 John it says, if someone who has worldly means sees a brother or a sister in need and refuses them compassion, how can the love of God remain in us? Children, let us love not in word or speech, but in deed and in truth. And that is what this symposium is about, isn't it? How to love in deed and in truth. In Texas, they have their own version of the Bible. It's primarily put on road signs. And they have a different version, which simply says that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, God. We don't care about climate change just because of the polar bears. We care about climate change because it exacerbates the risks that we all face today, especially the poorest and the most vulnerable among us. And now we get to myth number 3. It will bankrupt us to fix it. Or alternatively, one that I hear a lot too is the moral case for fossil fuels, because look at all the benefits that the Industrial Revolution brought us, and don't get me wrong, it did. It did bring us many benefits. What type of benefits? Our food does not perish. We don't have to go gather it every day. We have lights, so we don't have to wake up at dawn and go to sleep at dusk. We have electricity. Have you ever stopped to think about how amazing electricity is? We have vehicles that take us places quickly. And most of all, we have modern medicine that makes our lives much safer and longer and higher quality than it would be otherwise. When we look around the world, there are over 1 billion people in this world living without energy. And so we often say, don't they need fossil fuels just like we did? There's 2 reasons, at least 2 reasons, there's probably more. There's 2 reasons why the answer to that is no. Now, I'm not saying people shouldn't be allowed to make their own choices. Absolutely, people can choose whatever they want. Why are fossil fuels not the answer for the world at this time, even though they were 300 years ago? They're not the answer because it's like saying to people in Africa, you can't get cell phones. You're only ready for the party line telephone at this point. We'll let you know when you're ready for cell phones. Or you're not ready for, cars. You're only working on the Model T Ford at this point. I mean, how patronizing and colonialistic is that? It's incredible if people would just stop to listen to themselves when they say that. Why else doesn't it work? Well, one reason is pollution, air pollution. Did you know that just burning fossil fuels, so I'm not talking about carbon dioxide, I'm not talking about climate change, I'm just talking about the yucky, nasty stuff that comes out of the tailpipes of our cars and the smokestacks of our factories. Did you know that burning fossil fuels and also burning wood inside poor people's homes for cooking purposes kills more than 5 million people every year, including 200,000 in the United States? Imagine, and I don't mean to minimize this, but imagine if terrorism killed 200,000 people in the United States every year. Imagine what our world would look like, imagine what our news would look like, imagine what our fundings would look like. Air pollution kills 200,000 people in the US every year. Why don't we hear more about it? Because it's always been with us. It's been with us for hundreds of years, and frankly, The people who are dying are the people who live in the poor neighborhoods, who can't afford to live not beside a freeway or not beside a factory. That is reason number one. Reason number two why fossil fuels are not the answer for poor countries is because if you look at where the world's coal is, if you look at where the world's oil is, if you look at where the world's natural gas is, where is it? It's not in the countries where people suffer from energy poverty, with maybe the exception of Nigeria and perhaps Venezuela. The vast majority of fossil fuel reserves are in North America, Europe, and the Middle East. So saying you need fossil fuels to develop is like saying, let us sell you something that you don't have so that you will be forever indebted to us. How does that sound? So what is the answer? Well, the good news is that there's a lot of sun and wind to go around, isn't there? And so I want to share a couple of my favorite stories with you that just completely bust this myth that we need fossil fuels for poor people, or that it will somehow bankrupt us if we fix this climate thing by switching to clean sources of energy that don't produce carbon dioxide. Here's just a few of my favorite stories from this past year. 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa don't have electricity, and they are being electrified by pay-as-you-go solar that grows the local economy. What does pay-as-you-go solar look like? Some of it looks like this. How cool is that? What about India? India, I had to pick from a million headlines to pick one. One headline this year is that India is setting record low prices for solar energy. They are smashing the prices of solar energy anywhere in the world. They're at about 3 cents a kilowatt hour now. That's one of the cheapest prices for solar energy in the entire world. Now, I know there's at least one or two people here who are thinking, okay, sure, that's Africa, that's India, but what about China, right? Because we know, if you've ever been to China or if you just see the pictures, we know that air pollution there is terrible because in past decades they were building the equivalent of a coal-fired power plant a day, right? Anybody heard that stat, coal-fired power plant a day? Well, I looked up that stat, and you know what? In the first part of 2017, at least, when I looked it up, China was actually shutting down or canceling a coal-fired power plant a day. Bet you hadn't heard that in the news, had you? Why? It's being replaced with clean energy. A headline this spring was China aims to spend at least $360 billion on renewable energy. Why are they doing that? Is the entire country a bunch of tree huggers? Are they doing it out of the goodness of their hearts? No, they're doing it because it actually makes financial sense. And the headline last week was China meets its 2020 clean energy goals now, 3 years ahead of schedule. They lead the world. The United States is lagging in clean energy behind China and will soon be lagging behind India as well. Even in Texas, every spring we see headlines, Texas wind power breaks another record. This spring we got 23% of our electricity from wind in the state of Texas. Fort Hood, the biggest military base in the whole country, is in Texas, of course. Biggest, yes. And that is a picture of their new energy source. Wind and solar energy saves Fort Hood $168 million over using natural gas. It's cheaper. And there's even entire towns like little Georgetown, Texas, that are going renewable energy because it's actually going to save them money. You might say, but what about all those people who will lose their jobs? And it's true, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, there are winners and losers. But when even the Kentucky Coal Museum is going solar, you know things are changing. If you suspect any of this is fake news, I assure you it's not, but I do encourage you to Google it just to be sure. Today, there are twice as many jobs or more in the solar energy industry as in the coal industry in the United States. In San Antonio, a solar installation firm is taking in out-of-work oil patch workers who lost their job due to price fluctuations and retraining them to do solar panel installations. In Wyoming, a Chinese wind company is coming in and offering free job retraining to coal miners in Wyoming. And we haven't even talked about the benefits, the health benefits. We talked about how fossil fuels are not the answer to air pollution, but a study this August estimated the economic benefits in terms of saved health costs at $87 billion in the US alone. This is some pretty hard cash. When we look around the entire world, fossil fuels are estimated by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to be subsidized to the tune of about $5 trillion a year, which is $168,000 a second. Those are the fossil fuel subsidies compared to the trivial subsidies on wind energy and solar energy. So that's why I think a great idea is to take all subsidies off. It won't bankrupt the economy. In fact, economies in emerging nations are thriving on clean energy. There will be some winners and losers, and that's why the fossil fuel industry is one of the primary industries that actually puts money into organizations to attack and harass scientists like me. Because they will be some of the losers, and 5 out of the 10 richest companies in the world are fossil fuel companies. But the reality is, for all of us, we have some choices to make at this point. And when I look to these choices, again, my guide is not what's in my head, not all the facts and figures and data that are shoved into my head. My guide for how to respond to this, how to respond to the fact that it's real, it's not a false religion. The impacts matter to us and even more to poor people, not just to polar bears. It won't bankrupt the economy. In fact, it's good for most of us. Most of us, not everybody, it's good for most of us to fix this thing. How I respond is not from all the information in my head, it's from the heart. And for me, what's in my heart, what I believe is in my heart, is the love of God that's been poured out in that heart. And when we look to the Bible, my favorite verse is this one, that God has not given us a spirit of fear. We're not to respond to these issues out of fear. We are to respond out of power, out of love, and, my favorite, as you can imagine, with a sound mind. So in the last few minutes here, let me say, what can we all do about this? What can I do as a single person about this issue? Now, as you can imagine, I have a video about that. Of course. Global Weirding on PBS. And what I do is every other week, one week we release a new video, and then the next week I do a live Q&A on Facebook. My Facebook page is just my name, Katharine Hayhoe, and our next live Q&A is tomorrow night. So if you have any questions, this is such a big group and such a dark auditorium, it's hard to take questions after this. If you have any questions, get on Facebook, if you don't mind, or if you're not on Facebook, find somebody who is. Probably the person sitting beside you is. My mother isn't, but she sits beside me. Get on Facebook and join us tomorrow night on my page for our Q&A. We have a lot of fun. We go through about 100 questions in about 35 minutes. We keep it going like this. And also, I often point people to these videos. But if you really want to know, what can I do? The number one thing that we can do is going to surprise you. The number one thing we can do is talk about this. Because did you know that about 3/4 of us rarely, if ever, hear anybody talk about it? Not just ourselves, but anybody else. And so when we don't talk about it, what impression are we left with? That it doesn't matter. Now, when I say talk about it, I don't mean bring out all the scientific data and facts and hit people over the head with it. No, I mean talk about, hey, did you know that a Chinese company is retraining coal workers who are losing their jobs? Or did you know that Texas got 23% of its energy from wind? Or did you know that India's setting? We can talk about these types of things. Or did you know that hurricanes, they're not getting more frequent, but their impacts are getting stronger because of all the things that are happening in the ocean? Or did you know all that heavy rain we've been getting? That's been adding up too. There are things that we can do and things that we can say that make a difference. Now, of course, our personal actions matter too, and that's why I always encourage people to go to a carbon calculator. and figure out what our footprint is and where it's coming from. It might surprise you. There's things that we can do specifically in our personal lives to make a difference, and surprisingly, you might not believe it, one of the biggest things that as individuals we can do, now as corporately, one of the biggest things we can do is wean ourselves off fossil fuels. There is no question about that. But individually, one of the biggest things we can do is eat lower down the food chain. Because the way we get our food, especially if it comes from beef versus chicken, from chicken versus fish, or from meat versus vegetables, that makes a big difference in our carbon footprint. Cows produce a lot of heat-trapping gases. Mostly out the front end, but a little bit out the back too. If you want ideas, I encourage you to join this online community called climatecaretakers.org. Every month, they send you an idea of what you can do that month, and if you've already done it, they have idea number 2 and idea number 3. Check out Climate Caretakers. We can work together for corporate action, whether it's churches donating their roofs to the community as a solar garden, or whether it's Houghton College in upstate New York, which is only a little bit bigger than Westminster, 1,200 students. Yet they installed the biggest solar power array of any educational institution in the whole state of New York. Talk about a witness to the community. So what's the bottom line here? We can acknowledge that this thing is real. It really is real. We can help others prepare. These are some amazing fog nets that they're putting up to collect water in Africa. We can support organizations that understand this. And I love organizations like Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, or Micah Challenge, or Plant with Purpose. That's a picture of their farmers. We can tell people we care, and I support an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby that is totally bipartisan, but goes to our elected representatives and says, hey, we care about a changing climate, and here's why. The bottom line is this. The facts are not enough, and as Jane Goodall said, you know Jane Goodall? This is a picture of her back in the 70s working with chimpanzees. As Jane Goodall said just recently, one of the most famous scientists who inspired me personally today, she said, it is only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential. Or as the Bible says, the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love. I will leave you with this thought because this is what activism is all about. It is about what is in our hearts being expressed through love. So how can we work together in hope, not fear, with a spirit of what unites us rather than what divides us to change the world? Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hayhoe. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Hayhoe. That was outstanding. And I would like to now, I'm Kurt Jefferson, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Global Initiatives here at Westminster College. Such a wonderful talk and a wonderful way to kick off our wonderful symposium. Now we take a 15-minute break, and then we have 2 options for executive sessions. One that will be here in Champ Auditorium, Dr. David Collins and Vic Holmes on the fight for marriage equality in the state of Texas. And then the other is Aaron Wise, who's a Native American and an activist for the against the Dakota Pipeline Project up in North Dakota, and that will be in the St. Mary the Virgin Aldermanbury Church. So you have a choice between the 2 executive sessions. Go enjoy those, and we'll be back here after those sessions, after lunch at 1:30 for the breakout sessions, all throughout Coulter Science Lecture Hall. Coulter Science Center. Thank you.